What would you do if the woman who destroyed your marriage years ago came crawling back, and instead of your husband choosing you, his own mother handed you a check for $5 million and told you to disappear because some loves are just too powerful to fight and some women are just meant to win no matter how much you sacrificed or how deeply you loved? But what his mother didn't know was that I had a secret so devastating, so earth-shattering that when the truth finally came out it would just destroy their perfect reunion. It would burn their entire world to ashes. And the irony, the beautiful tragic irony, is that the ex-wife, the woman they both wanted so desperately, was never who they thought she was at all. So if you want to know how a timid housewife became the one holding all the cards, how $5 million became the least important thing in this story, and how one DNA test changed everything, then stay with me, because this is not a story about a woman who got replaced. This is a story about a woman who discovered she was never the replacement to begin with. And if you're loving this drama, hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next when the truth finally explodes. The check was sitting on the kitchen counter when I came home from the grocery store that Tuesday afternoon, and I remember thinking how strange it looked just lying there between the fruit bowl and the stack of unopened mail, like it was the most casual thing in the world. But nothing about that check was casual, because it had my name on it, Miranda Chan, and below that $5 million, and it was signed by Dorothy Harrington, my mother-in-law, a woman who had barely looked me in the eye during the 7 years I'd been married to her son. And I stood there with bags of groceries cutting into my palms, feeling my heart start to hammer, because I knew what this meant before I even saw her sitting in our living room in the chair by the window, the one that caught the afternoon light, the one where I used to nurse our daughter Emma while reading parenting books and dreaming about the life we were building. And Dorothy looked up at me with this expression that I'd never seen on her face before, something like pity mixed with determination, mixed with what I can only describe as relief. And she said, "Miranda, we need to talk about your marriage." And I wanted to laugh, because that's what people say when they trying to be gentle, when they trying to soften a blow. But there was nothing soft about what was coming. I could feel it in the air like electricity before a storm. And she told me that Vanessa was back, and I felt my knees go weak, because Vanessa was the name we never spoke, the ghost that had haunted my marriage since the beginning, my husband's first wife, the woman he'd loved so completely, so utterly, that everyone, including me, had always known I was just filling a space she'd left behind. And Dorothy said Vanessa had been sick, very sick, with cancer, and she'd gone away 5 years ago to spare James the pain of watching her die. But now she was better, she was in remission, and she'd come home, and she wanted him back. And the truly devastating part, the part that made me want to vomit right there on our hardwood floors, was that James wanted her back too. And Dorothy said, "I'm so sorry, Miranda, you're a good woman, you've been a wonderful wife and a beautiful mother, but some connections are just too deep to sever. And James and Vanessa, they have something that transcends normal love, they're soulmates, and it would be fair to keep them apart when life has given them this second chance. And I'm prepared to make sure you and Emma are taken care of financially. The check is just the beginning. There will be more, a trust fund for Emma's education, a house wherever you want to live, monthly support, whatever you need. And all I am asking is that you make this easy, that you let him go with dignity and grace, because fighting this will only hurt everyone, especially your daughter." And I stood there listening to this woman tell me that my marriage was over, that I was being bought out like a business partner who'd overstayed their welcome. And the most horrifying part was that she wasn't being cruel. She genuinely believed she was being generous, that $5 million was a gift, not a bribe. And I looked at that check, and I thought about all the nights I'd spent alone while James worked late, all the times I caught him staring at old photographs, all the moments when I'd felt him comparing me to her and finding me lacking, and something inside me just broke, but not in the way Dorothy expected, because I didn't cry, I didn't scream. I just picked up that check, and I folded it very carefully, and I put it in my pocket, and I said, "When?" And Dorothy looked confused, and she said, "When what?" And I said, "When does he want me gone?" And she said, "By the end of the month, if possible. Vanessa is staying at a hotel, and it's awkward for everyone." And I nodded like this made perfect sense, like I was agreeing to change our cable package, not dissolve my entire life. And I said, "I'll need to talk to Emma, she's only 6, she won't understand." And Dorothy reached out like she might touch my hand, but stopped herself, and she said, "LL, make sure Emma understands that sometimes mommies and daddies need to live separately, but they both still love her very much." And I wanted to laugh at the "we" in that sentence, as if Dorothy and Vanessa were already co-parenting my child, already erasing me from the family portrait. And then James came home, and I watched him walk through the door, this man I'd loved for 9 years, married to for 7, and he couldn't even look at me. And I knew then that Dorothy hadn't acted alone, that this had been discussed and planned, and I was the last to know about my own divorce. And he said, "Miranda, I'm sorry, I never meant for this to happen." And I said, "Did you sleep with her?" And his silence was answer enough. And I felt something cold settle into my chest like ice crystallizing around my heart. And I said, how long has she been back? And he said, 3 weeks, and I did the math. 3 weeks of him coming home late, 3 weeks of distracted kisses, and one word answers, 3 weeks of him already leaving me before he had the courage to say the words. And I asked, does Emma know? And he said, not yet, we wanted to tell you first, and that we that casual we as if he and Vanessa were already a unit, already excluding me. And I said, fine, I'll go, I'll take the money, and I'll leave, and you can have your great love story. And the relief on his face was so palpable, so devastating, that I had to turn away. And that night I packed a bag and I took Emma and I went to my sister Rachel's apartment across town, and Emma kept asking why we were having a sleepover on a school night. And I told her mommy just needed a little break, and she accepted this because children are trusting, because she had no idea her world was about to implode. And Rachel held me while I finally cried, and she said, you're worth so much more than this. And I said, apparently I'm worth exactly $5 million. And she said, what are you going to do? And I said, I don't know, but I am not signing anything until I talk to a lawyer. And that's when everything started to unravel, because the lawyer I hired was a woman named Diane Chun who specialized in high net worth divorces. And she took one look at Dorothy's offer and she said, this is unusual. And I said, unusual how? And she said, they're offering you far more than you get in court, even with alimony and child support. This is settlement money. This is make a problem go away money. And I said, maybe they just feel guilty. And Diane said, maybe, or maybe there's something else going on, something they don't want coming out in divorce proceedings. And she said, I'd like to do some digging if you let me. And I said, dig. And so she dug, and what she found was that Vanessa Chun had never had cancer, that there were no medical records, no hospital stays, no treatments, nothing. And when Diane told me this, I felt the world tilt, because if Vanessa hadn't been sick, then why had she left, and why had James believed she was dying? And Diane said, I think we need to find out who Vanessa really is. And so we hired a private investigator, a man named Tom Rodriguez, who looked like someone's grandfather but had a reputation for uncovering things people wanted buried. And Tom came back 2 weeks later with a file so thick it needed a rubber band, and he sat in Diane's office and he said, you going to want to sit down for this? And I was already sitting. I gripped the arms of my chair anyway. And Tom said, Vanessa Chun, formerly Vanessa Wade, changed her name 7 years ago, right around the time she divorced James. And I said I knew about the name change. She said she wanted a fresh start. And Tom said, did you know she changed it because she was running from fraud charges in Nevada? And my heart stopped. And he said Vanessa Wade was involved in a real estate scam that bilked elderly investors out of millions, and when the investigation got close, she vanished, and James's family money, specifically his trust fund, paid for her to disappear, paid for the name change, paid for her to start over. And the reason she came back now is because the statute of limitations ran out 6 months ago. She's safe now, and she wants back into the life she left behind. And I felt sick, because this meant James knew, it meant Dorothy knew, it meant my entire marriage had been built on a foundation of lies. And I said, why didn't anyone tell me? And Tom said, because you weren't supposed to be permanent, you were the placeholder, the nice safe woman who'd keep James stable while Vanessa was in hiding. And now that she's back, they want to return to the original plan. And I thought about that check, about Dorothy's kind eyes and generous offer, and I realized it wasn't kindness at all, it was damage control. And Diane said, we have enough here to bury them in court, but I think there's more. And I said, what do you mean? And she said, I want to DNA test Emma. And the room went silent, and I said, what, why? And Diane said, because the timeline is bothering me. Vanessa left 5 years ago, Emma is 6, which means you were already pregnant when Vanessa disappeared. And I've seen cases like this before, where families do desperate things to keep bloodlines intact. And I felt my stomach drop, because I knew what she was implying. And I said, you think Emma might not be James's daughter? And Diane said, I think we should find out. And I wanted to say no, wanted to refuse, because Emma was James's daughter. She had his eyes, his smile. But Diane said, if there's any chance, any possibility, then we need to know, because it changes everything. And so I agreed, and we did the test using hair from Emma's brush and a coffee cup James had left at the house. And we waited, and those 2 weeks were the longest of my life, because I kept looking at Emma, trying to see the truth in her face and wondering how I could have been so blind. And when the results came back, Diane called me into her office, and her face was grave, and she said, Miranda, Emma is not James's biological daughter. And the world stopped spinning. And I said, that's impossible. I never cheated. I was never with anyone else. And Diane said, I believe you, which is why we ran another test. And she slid a paper across the desk, and she said, Emma's DNA shows she's related to the Harrington family, but not through James. And I stared at that paper, trying to make sense of the words. And Diane said, Miranda, Emma is Dorothy's biological grandchild, but her father isn't James, it's Christopher, James's younger brother, who died in a car accident 8 years ago, right before you and James got married. And I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, because Christopher had been James's best man, Christopher, who I'd known for years, Christopher, who I D. Been close to in the way you're close to your fiancé's family. And Diane said, did you and Christopher ever? And I said, no, never. I Dawn. T. Understand. And then like a dam breaking, the memory came flooding back. The engagement party the night before, James and I got married when I'd had too much champagne, and Christopher had walked me to the guest room because I was dizzy, and I D. woken up the next morning with gaps in my memory and a terrible headache, and I'd thought it was just the alcohol, but what if it wasn't? What if Christopher had done something and I'd never known? And the room was spinning, and Diane said, there's more, and I said, how can there possibly be more? And she said, we found something in Christopher's old emails. Apparently, he confessed what he'd done to Dorothy before he died, told her that he D. assaulted you that night, but begged her not to say anything because it would destroy the family. And Dorothy had known for 6 years that Emma wasn't James's daughter, that her son was raising his brother's child conceived through rape, and she'd said nothing. And suddenly the $5 million made perfect sense, because if this came out, if anyone knew that Dorothy had covered up her son's crime, that she'd let James raise a child that was his, that she built her family on lies and violence and secrets, then the Harrington name would be destroyed. And I sat there in that office and I realized I had more power than I D. ever imagined. And Diane said, what do you want to do? And I thought about James and his great love, Vanessa, the woman who D. conned elderly people out of their savings, and I thought about Dorothy and her generous offer and her terrible secrets, and I thought about Emma, my beautiful innocent Emma, who deserved so much better than this poisoned family. And I said, I want them to know, I want them to understand exactly what they've done. And so we called a meeting, James and Dorothy and even Vanessa, all sitting in Diane's conference room, and I walked in with the DNA results and the private investigator's report, and I laid it all out on the table, and I watched their faces as they realized what I knew. And James went pale, and he said, that's not possible, Christopher never. And I said, Christopher did, and your mother knew. And Dorothy's face crumbled, and she said, Miranda, please, I was trying to protect the family. And I said, you were trying to protect a rapist, and you let an innocent child be raised in a lie. And Vanessa looked between all of them, clearly trying to understand what was happening. And I turned to her and I said, did you know that Dorothy paid for you to disappear? Did you know that you were part of a deal to cover up fraud and keep you hidden until the statute of limitations ran out? And her face told me she had. T. and James said, Vanessa, what is she talking about? And I watched his perfect reunion dissolve in real time, and Vanessa said, James the first can explain. And he said, did you have cancer? And her silence was damning, and he said, so everything was a lie? And she said, I did it for us. And he said, you did it for yourself. And the cracks were showing now, the beautiful story falling apart. And I said, here's what's going to happen, James, you're going to give me full custody of Emma, and you're going to set up a trust fund in her name, $20 million, not 5, because that's what covering up your family's crimes costs. And you're never going to contact us again. And Dorothy, you're going to sell one of your investment properties and donate the proceeds to organizations that support survivors of sexual assault. And you're going to do it publicly without explanation. And Vanessa, you're going to leave town again, and this time you're going to stay gone, because if any of you refuse, if any of you fight me, then I'm going to the press with all of this, the fraud, the rape, the cover-up, all of it. And I burn the Harrington name to the ground. And I watched Dorothy age 10 years in that moment, and James just sat there broken, and Vanessa was already calculating her exit. I could see it in her eyes. And Dorothy said, you really destroy us? And I said, you already destroyed yourselves. I'm just refusing to go down with the ship. And that was 6 months ago, and now I am sitting in a house I bought with my own money, not theirs, in a town 3 states away, and Emma is starting 2nd grade. And she knows James as the man who used to be married to mommy, not as daddy, because we rebuilding a new truth, one where she doesn't carry the weight of other people's sins. And I never cashed Dorothy's check. I sent it back torn into pieces because I didn't want their guilt money. I wanted their admission and their consequences, and I got both. And sometimes late at night I think about that moment in my kitchen when I saw that check and thought my life was ending, and I realize now that it wasn't an ending at all. It was the first honest moment in years, because everything before that had been a carefully constructed lie. And I'd been living in a story someone else wrote, and the most powerful thing I ever did was taking their money or exposing their secrets. It was deciding that my daughter and I deserved better than being footnotes in someone else's great romance. And here's the thing, they tell you about being betrayed, about having your life dismantled by people who were supposed to love you. What they tell you is that sometimes when everything falls apart, you find out you were stronger than you ever knew, that you were never the weak link, you were the only thing holding a rotten structure together. And when you finally let go, when you finally walk away, the relief is almost overwhelming. And I heard through mutual friends that James and Vanessa tried to make it work for about 2 months before the reality of who they both were became too much to ignore. And last I heard, he in therapy and she's in another state probably running another con, and Dorothy sold her property like I asked and made the donation, but she did it quietly without fanfare because even in penance the Harringtons can quite bring themselves to be fully honest, and as for me, I'm learning who I am without them, without the weight of being compared to a ghost, without the constant feeling that I am not quite enough. And Emma asks about James sometimes, and I tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways, that people sometimes make mistakes and families change, and that's okay because love isn't about staying in places that hurt you. It's about building something new, something true, and maybe someday when she's older I'll tell her the whole story. I'll tell her about the $5 million check and the secrets and the DNA test and the moment her mother became someone who bought or silenced, but for now I just hold her and I tell her she's loved and she's safe, and that's enough because in the end that's what we all deserve, not grand gestures or dramatic reunions, but simple honest love that doesn't come with conditions or lies or expiration dates. And if James and Dorothy and Vanessa ever understood that, they might have stood a chance, but they built their lives on fiction, on the idea that some loves are worth any cost, any betrayal, and what they learned too late is that love built on lies isn't love at all. It's just another story we tell ourselves to justify the inexcusable. And I'm done with their stories now. I'm writing my own.